If you're a white person watching this video, I want you to ask yourself this question. Why do you think other white people get so defensive when white people from the past, white books, white authors, white political figures from the past are accused of racism? Why do white people react so defensively to that? Hello and welcome back to Bookish Today. I wanted to do really what is another video in my series, Dear White People, in which I really try to point out some things that I think are just obvious and simple and yet incredibly damaging to American society and politics in the United States of America related to race. And I address these things to white people because, as you can see from this video, I'm a white person. I can't speak to the experience of black Americans or other groups in the United States or indigenous Americans. I can only speak to what it is to be a white person in the United States of America. So the title of this video, Not All White People, was inspired by, what became a social media reaction of lots of men to the Me Too movement. Men would see a tweet or something on social media about sexual assault or domestic abuse, and they would start off their response to that tweet with, "Not all men blank." And I've noticed, really disturbingly, over the course of the last year, I've made other videos about this, that a lot of white people seem to be responding in a similar way about issues related to racism, that they want to put out there that they themselves aren't a racist, which I've described in another video as literally the minimum level of human decency, is to not be a racist. And that part of their defensiveness about what they see, I guess, is attacks being made on white people and charges of racism. I guess what they see in that is an attack on themselves, and they see then any charges of racism on any people in the United States of America from any point in history as being attacks on white society and in some ways attacks on them. This defensiveness is ridiculous. There is no reason, I'm going to tell you right now, there is no reason why a white person feel like they have to defend racist white people from the past. You don't have to identify with them just because you're white. We don't have to do these knee-jerk defenses of white racists from America's past. Not only do we not have to do it, that kind of defensiveness is being used to frighten white voters into voting for people that they know are racist, voted for ideas they know are bigoted. There is a real consequence of that. So what I thought I would do today is I would go through a list of things that I have personal experience with white people on my channel and in other places essentially coming to the defense of white racists from the past. And so there are a few topics that come up. Now, this video is being put up this Thursday because of reactions to what I said about Gone with the Wind, which is a racist piece of Klan promoting racist violence, apologizing crap. But because I said something like that in my video about 11 modern classics you don't need to read, I've received a reminder about a lot of these things, so I thought I would address these issues directly. So these are topics that make white people defend racist white people from the past, and this is me telling you how not to respond. Not only do you not have to defend white racists of the past, but don't feel that urge to say these things, because in saying these things you are, in effect, maybe unintentionally, minimizing racism in the past and the effects of racism in the United States. So one of those topics is that whenever it's brought up that many of our founding fathers owned slaves, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, and others, even Benjamin Franklin owned a slave at one time. When it's pointed out the founding fathers owned slaves, people will inevitably react and say, yes, but some of the founding fathers opposed slavery. That's absolutely true. Does that diminish the fact? Does that answer the fact? Does that eliminate the fact that many of the most powerful founding fathers, many of the people on our money, were in fact slave owners? Okay? Another kind of thing that's connected to that is that people will say, oh yes, well the founding fathers were slave owners, but that was normal back then. Those were accepted ideas back then. And the answer is yes, those were accepted racist ideas back then. It was an accepted racist idea that people from Africa were inferior, that indigenous peoples, that First Nations people were barbarians. Those were accepted racist ideas. The fact that they were accepted by a broad segment of society doesn't make them less racist. As a matter of fact, the Founding Fathers themselves knew that what they believed in and the institution of slavery was racist. Now, as someone has pointed out to me, as though this somehow eliminates racism, the term racism is a relatively modern term, and people, like Thomas Jefferson wouldn't have known what the word racism means. But that doesn't mean that they didn't know what racism was, because they instituted a racist system of slavery. They instituted a system of chattel slavery based completely on race. They may not have called that, they may not have known to call that racism, but what else is it? They intentionally created a system which discriminated against people based on their race and their ethnicity. That is literally the definition of racism. Okay? And they practiced this, and they had qualms about this sometimes. And sometimes they felt bad about it. Did they stop doing it? No, they did not, because they were racist and they were profiting from a racist system. There's no reason why any white American in the United States of America should apologize for that, should try to deflect from that idea, from that truth, because it's truth. There's no reason to defend that. There's no reason to feel like as a white person you have to defend it. It is just kind of a collective fear-based reaction, I think, to criticism of the Founding Fathers. Another thing that comes up is just when the topic of slavery is mentioned, white people will oftentimes react. Even good-intended people who I don't believe are racist will feel compelled to say certain things about slavery. So if I were to be talking about chattel slavery here in the United States, inherited race-based slavery here in the United States, if I were to talk about all the horrors that took place in America, in the United States, under slavery, inevitably, and I imagine it will be true in the comments of this video as well, inevitably someone will say, well, the people in Africa sold other Africans into slavery. That's true. Does that diminish the horrors of slavery in the United States? Does that diminish the legacy of racism in the United States and slavery based on race in the United States? That fact is not a hidden fact. Everybody knows that fact, but it doesn't have anything to do with slavery in the United States. Okay? It just doesn't. And the only reason I can think of that people say that is to deflect and to, spread some of the guilt for slavery to other people. Fine, spread it to other people. That doesn't absolve the people here in the United States who instituted the chattel-based system of slavery in the United States. It doesn't absolve them of the nightmares they created here. People will also point out that slavery was worse in other places. That's absolutely true. Does that mean slavery wasn't awful here? No. It's nightmare versus, nightmare with a shorter lifespan. That's literally what we're talking about. Does that diminish the awfulness of slavery in the United States? No, it doesn't. Many people will point out that most of the people kidnapped in Africa and forced into slavery did not wind up in the United States. That's true. Does that change the condition of race-based chattel slavery and the nightmare that went along with it for the people from Africa who did end up in the United States? Of course it doesn't. And then finally, lots of people will say that slavery as an institution still happens all over the world. And therefore, making a big deal out of American slavery is ridiculous. How does that in any way, how does the fact that slavery still goes on, that the nightmare of slavery still exists, that it existed in other places before and after American slavery, how does that mean that the system of race-based chattel slavery in the United States of America wasn't a nightmare from which we are still trying to, work out our racial problems in the United States? These are all things people say in a defensive way to deflect the reality that chattel slavery in the United States was race-based. It was a nightmare that denied hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people their freedom, and killed them, worked them to death, and subjected them to sexual assault and all kinds of other deprivations. None of the things people say in response when we talk about slavery diminish those facts at all. Another thing that comes up is when we talk about the Civil War, if I were to say that the Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery, inevitably people would come up in my comments and say, oh, that's not true. Southerners were fighting for, political integrity and for states' rights. They were fighting for states' rights to maintain slavery. Look at the run-up to the Civil War. What was the issue dividing North and South as the United States territory expanded, whether or not that territory would be slave or free? It is essentially the election of Lincoln and the belief of the South that Lincoln would stop the expansion of slavery, which, they felt like justified their attempt to leave the United States of America and to fight a war. Look at these secession documents written by Southern politicians in every state in which they talk about the importance of the institution of slavery. Look at Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech in which he says the Confederacy is founded not on the idea that all men are created equal, but on the idea that white men are superior to black men. These are not things they hid. The Civil War is about slavery. People will come back and say, oh, well, fine, yes, so the South seceded over slavery, but the North wasn't fighting a war to end slavery. The North was just as racist as the South. That may in fact be true at the beginning, but once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, the war became, in popular vision, popular ways, about ending slavery. Did lots of Northerners oppose the war because it was about ending slavery? Yes. That doesn't mean the war wasn't about slavery. These things that we use, these things you hear people say, are intended to deflect blame from our racist past. And there's no reason for us to feel like we have to do that. And by doing that, we are clouding the issue and we are preventing the issues that we still have from being directly addressed. One of my favorites, and since this is book 2, I'll get to talk about racist books and authors. When I accuse Gone with the Wind of being a racist book, and why I accuse Margaret Mitchell of being a racist author and writing a racist book, lots of people will come back and say, well, what did you expect? Books written that time period were written by racists because racism was more widely accepted. That's absolutely true. Does that mean they're not racist? Does it? Does that mean that they're not racist? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that the books themselves aren't racist. It just means that at the time period they were written, racism was more widely accepted. In specifics, in dealing with Gone with the Wind, people say, oh, it was a book of its time. The book was written in the 1930s, not in the 1860s and 70s during which it's set. Margaret Mitchell didn't live through the Civil War and Reconstruction. She was writing a piece of historical fiction. And she wrote it in the 1930s. And people say, well, in the 1930s, she was reflecting the ideas of, Southerners towards the Civil War and Reconstruction. Fine, but that doesn't make it the book a product of its time. That makes it a product of a racist Southern society. Notice that it's still racist. The proof that the ideas that Mitchell included in the book Gone with the Wind were not popular accepted throughout the United States of America is that they edited those things out when they made the movie. The N-word is not used in the movie. The Klan is not specifically referred to in the movie. Acts of racist violence are obscured in the movie in ways in which they aren't in the book. So clearly the book is not a product of its time, it's a product of its culture. And that may have some resonance, but we can read lots of things other than Gone with the Wind about that. Some people say, oh, well, we have to not attack these books for being racist because it's not fair to attack authors for being racist who grew up in a racist society. I don't understand why you feel like you have to protect the reputation of authors from the past. We don't protect their reputation from other things. Why should we try to think we have to protect their reputation from being called racist when they were racists? This is just utterly ridiculous. People will say, oh, well, if we judge them, then people are going to judge us. Yes, they are, and they should. They should judge our society for its shortcomings, for its discriminations, for its racism, for its homophobia, for its treatment of indigenous First Nations people. We should be judged. We will be judged for our failure to deal with environmental issues, and we should be. There's no reason to defend these authors against these charges of racism. The only reason I can see why people do that is to prevent themselves from being accused of being racist for reading those books. You're not a racist for reading a book written by a racist. We all get to decide what level we're comfortable with. Right now I'm reading a book by Anthony Trollope, and it contains anti-Semitism. It's jarring, it's upsetting when I read that. Did I stop reading the book? I didn't. Okay? in part, for me, my decision about what book to call a racist book or an anti-Semitic book or whatever, and to discontinue reading it, is whether or not the racism in that book is reflective of the time period, or is it of the racism in the time period, or is it promoting racism? Okay, so the difference for me between, let's say, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer is that those books reflect the racist attitudes, the time period in which Mark Twain lived, and the racist attitudes he no doubt had. Whereas Margaret Mitchell's book not only reflects racism, it promotes it. She is actively promoting racism in that book. Okay, and if you want, I can leave the quote. If somebody wants, I'll leave the quotes that I found from the book that I think prove that. But there's a difference. But so for me, that makes, Gone with the Wind a book I don't read, and books by William Faulkner books that I do. Are they reflecting it, or are they promoting it? You get to decide. But, rejecting and choosing not to read a book because you believe it's racist is perfectly valid. It's the same kind of idea of rejecting and choosing not to read a book because it's over a subject or it covers a subject which makes you uncomfortable. That subject may be sexual assault, and you don't want to read a book about that. That subject may be cruelty to animals, and you don't want to read a book about that. We accept that people have these issues and they don't want to read books about that all the time. It's only when we charge a book with racism that we see these defenses of those books, which I feel, again, is completely unnecessary. Another topic that comes up all the time where I see these really defensive and really just, I think, directly racist reactions are when we talk about slavery, we talk about the way in which African Americans, black people in the United States have been treated, we talk about the civil rights movement and all the things that black Americans had to overcome, that I will get these ideas, or we talk about, like, for instance, we talk about police violence against African Americans, or when there have been killings of black men by policemen. One of the reactions that you always get from white people who feel compelled to offer these defenses is they'll point out things about crime statistics. They will point out, that crime, that black people commit more crimes than white people do, as though this somehow justifies the killing of people who've committed no crime by the policeman. Or if you point out that African Americans don't feel safe in the United States of America, they'll tell you, well, you obviously haven't been to inner city Detroit or Philadelphia anymore. That if you went there as a white person, you'd be a victim of crime. And one of the things that I think is funny about that last one is that they really are missing the point. What they're saying is that they, as a white person, and I, as a white person, feel safe everywhere in the United States except certain places. And what I'm saying is that as a black person in the United States of America, black people oftentimes don't feel safe anywhere in the United States of America. They don't feel safe from racist violence anywhere in the United States of America. And these white apologists seem to feel like that by pointing out that a white person might not be safe in the inner city, that somehow they're countering that. So, I can avoid going to the inner cities if I choose to. Black people can't avoid living in the entire United States of America and still be American citizens. So to me, that's a ridiculous idea. And the idea that crime statistics based on race prove that in some way, I guess these people are trying to prove, that racism against black people in the past is justified and racism against black people in the present is justified, is just utterly ridiculous because it doesn't look at anything else. To be honest with you, if we wanted to look at where the criminal problem is, particularly with violent crime, we would eliminate race and we would just look at age. Because the vast majority of violent crimes are committed by people of all races, between about the ages of 17 and 30. That it's a youth crime problem, not a black crime problem, it's a youth crime problem. And when you factor then in age and poverty, you really eliminate the differences in crime rates between white Americans and black Americans. So this idea that black people commit more crimes and therefore somehow that justifies racism and fear is as ridiculous as anything else. And mentioning those things is a defensive statement which really verges on direct racism. And then I guess kind of ultimately, one of the things that I see this happening, and this I've made videos about before, so I won't go into this very much, is just the teaching of American history. That, currently right now, people from Ron DeSantis to, people upset and going to school board meetings seem to be upset that schools are teaching the truth about our racist past. The truth of the matter is, we, descendants of American settlers, we stole land from Native Americans. We addicted them to substances. We spread diseases intentionally and unintentionally. We waged war on them. We kicked them off their land. We waged a genocidal war against Native Americans, indigenous people in this country, up until the 20th century. That's the truth. Now, you may not like hearing the truth, but that doesn't mean that that shouldn't be taught. Because something makes somebody uncomfortable doesn't mean it should not be taught in American history. Obviously, in different ways and different levels depending on age group. Okay? And there's no reason to become really defensive about the Founding Fathers and to claim that, these people are undermining faith in the United States of America. They're not. They're not undermining faith in the United States of America by pointing out our racist past. If anything, what they're showing is that we can make progress from a racist past into the present, and that we should continue to try to make that progress because that makes the United States better. The more progress we make on issues related to race, the closer we come to actually fulfilling the words that we claim this country is based on. The idea that all men are created equal, the idea that we all have unalienable rights. That those things we come closer to the more we accept and the more we deal with the truth of our past. So anyway, I just wanted to make this video about this issue of not all white people and encourage you, if you are a white person, to stop being defensive. Stop being so defensive when the truth is pointed out about authors or political figures or the Founding Fathers or specific events from the past which make white people in the past look like racists because they were racist, and there's no reason to defend that. None. And in the process of defending it, you're making it more difficult for us to make progress. And the proof of that is that we still have to deal with a politician like Donald Trump and the members of his party who he endorses and who continue to promote his point of view. Anyway, there you go. There's my thoughts today. I'm not sure that made sense in the end. Hopefully I stayed on target. Let me know in the comments section below. And as always, thank you for watching.